Back with you tonight on In Focus. Thanks for staying on. The government has promised to ensure the independence of the media and respecting media in the country. It comes as the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom, which is celebrated globally today, is being observed. For more on this, we're joined now by Stellenbosch University's Professor William Wasserman, as well as William Bird from Media Monitoring South Africa, to help us in the conversation. Gentlemen, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time tonight here on In Focus. A day when professionals in the sector, in the media, but also other stakeholders reflect on press freedom and professional ethics in this particular space, and we'll try and touch on those. But this day, of course, comes on the back of William Bird, back and forth with government on the appointment of the board at the SABC, but also we are looking at how a media entity exposed possibly one of the biggest stories that we are talking about now, an escape at one of our correctional facilities. When you look at both those instances, and by and large the involvement even of politicians in all those stories, how free is our press in South Africa?
Well, you know, it's a bit like the stories that you revealed. It tends to occur on two extremes, right? You've got incredible levels of amazing journalism where they reveal things, they expose things, they put their lives at great risk to reveal things, including the Gupta leaks. From the Gupta leaks to the National Lotteries Commission stories, to more recently the Thabo Bester story. And then you see things where the media often are their own worst enemy, where they undermine media freedom in the way that they behave. You think of the decouplet story, for example. There are a number of other instances where media act contrary to their own best interests, and then you've got some in government who think that it's a good idea to try and undermine media freedom, either through their direct actions of seeking to, as the previous minister did, interfere in the affairs of the board, or you get it through indirect measures where they attack and undermine the credibility of the media. So you've got quite a mixed sort of a notion of what really constitutes media freedom, and of course you're then getting journalists attacked regularly online. So, but as a constitutional democracy, there's still very high levels of media freedom. We are significantly better than countries where you aren't even allowed to criticize the leadership or the president without, for example, risking being put in jail or being harassed or murdered, just taken out. There's certainly a lot of things we can be pleased about.
Would you say we should count ourselves lucky, because the UN speaks of, when they speak of press under attack, as you put it, they actually speak of people being not just harassed on social media, but actually being taken out?
Well, yes and no. There are a lot of really good things there, but there's also a lot of things to be deeply worried about. When our journalists are routinely attacked or undermined on social media, you've got a former president taking a journalist to court over something which seems clearly an effort to undermine and belittle the ability to report, and then you've got them effectively sanctioning her being trolled ruthlessly on social media, and that happens to a number of journalists. We've seen Newzroom Afrika journalists attacked by politicians, by political parties. So there are definitely some very worrying signs by people that don't seem to register the difference and the critical importance. It's one thing to be a politician, but you're there by virtue of the rights in a democracy, and part of that democratic right and part of that structure is the critical importance of having journalism. And if you don't support one, and if you allow people to undermine it, you're necessarily undermining your own ability to function in a democratic state.
I'll come back in a moment to that, and whether or not we appreciate that relationship between press freedom and how important it is in a freedom in general. Just the other day we were celebrating Freedom Day. But Prof, let me bring you in here. I started off by saying we were sitting in a situation where we were waiting for a politician to finally appoint a board at a public broadcaster. Are we maintaining a healthy enough distance between the powers that be and the press in the country?
Well, I think in general there has always been a healthy tension in the democratic era between the press and the government. I think that tension is inherent in press relations with governments in democracies. And I think we've been doing well in that regard. I think the SABC, of course, is to some extent an exception in that regard. And we have seen some worrying instances of editorial interference in the past, and in this case, we've seen also problematic situation where the board wasn't appointed for a long time, which raises questions around the public accountability and the governance of the public broadcaster. But I think in general, we have quite a robust media, a media that is very brave, very outspoken, that has done really important work in the last number of years to unearth big scandals of corruption in government and elsewhere. So I think in that regard, we can be very proud of what our media has achieved in the last number of years.
Yeah, and the question is how then the tensions. My suspicion is that the more factional battles are being fought within political parties, especially the ruling party, the media almost becomes a casualty of that to some extent. How have the intense fighting of the political elite impacted on how the media interacts with that story?
Well, I think, you would often see, I think that's to be expected, that the different factions in politics will strive to dominate the media agenda, try to make their voices heard. I think I maybe flip the question around a bit and also say that it's important for the media also to cover politics, not only in terms of, like a boxing match and sort of fighting factions against each other and see who's scoring the most points, but asking substantive issues. I think as we're going into elections next year, I think it will be really important for the media to use this freedom responsibly to ask substantive, informed questions around policy, and not only focusing on the personalities, and certainly not only doing this sort of stenography that you'd only repeat press releases and what politicians say today and what they say tomorrow, as if you were just commenting on a sort of sports match. I think it's really important that the media play that substantive role in democracy to ask deep, difficult, complex questions around policy, around elections coming up. So yes, that's, I think, a challenge for the media in the next year ahead. Yeah,
William, but back to that question. We were talking Freedom Day just the other day. People were being asked, and they said, well, there's really no freedom in South Africa. I wonder, do we appreciate what press freedom really means in the context of a free and a democratic South Africa?
Look, we need to challenge that because that's just nonsense. If you compare where we were prior to becoming a constitutional democracy to where we are now, yes, we've got massive problems and massive issues, and there's poverty and unemployment and crime and all of these terrible things. But to suggest that we know better today than we were then is just patently not true. The fact is before we became a democracy, you couldn't say what you wanted. You would be arrested. You would be jailed. Journalists were jailed routinely as a matter of course. It's just incredible to suggest that there is no freedom now. That it just simply isn't the case. As Justice Albie Sachs said recently at a talk at Prof. Wasserman's university recently, they said to him, "Is this the country that you fought for?" He said, "This is the country I fought for, but it's not the society that we need or that we want." And it's the same thing with media freedom. We've got a lot. There's a huge number of things that we can be getting right and that we need to be getting right, especially in the context of rising mis and disinformation. The media now is even more critical because you need to know that you can go to X, Y, and Z source to get news information that you can actually rely on, that's been verified, that's accurate, and that's true. 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have a Newzroom Afrika. The thought of Newzroom Afrika as a channel wouldn't have been countenanced, So to suggest that is just not true. We need to fight back against that because there are significant gains and we must protect them because they are essential to our survival as a democratic state.
Prof, there is also a feeling that even independent media is not as independent as it should be because it is dictated to, certainly by those with deep pockets and those who own it. And the feeling in South Africa is that it's largely owned by a few powerful players.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of economic pressures, commercial pressures on media and media independence is a perennial question. That is, I think maybe the word dictated to is maybe a bit strong, but I think commercial interests, and not only in the commercial media sector, but also, in the public broadcasting sector, we have a public broadcast that also relies on commercial revenue to a large extent, for instance, community media. So yes, I think these are pressures that we need to be aware of. But a related question is also the viability of media. We just spent the whole day here today at a press freedom seminar speaking about community media, for instance. The community media sector often struggling to just survive. And when you have those sort of struggles for survival, then you become more vulnerable to outside influence, to media capture, and so on. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword. You have to remain commercially viable, you have to remain sustainable, at the same time also be editorially independent. But it's an important question. I think when we talk about independence, we often frame that in terms of government or political independence. And I think it is always important to add to that although that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be commercially viable or successful, that you should be make sure that the editorial principles and the ethical principles that underpin good journalism are not threatened by these commercial imperatives. And, as William has mentioned, we have seen, unfortunately, in the last number of years, some egregious instances of unethical behavior, sort of stories just blatantly made up, like the dectuplets story, the Satchel report a few years ago, highlighting some of the editorial missteps and unethical behavior that where media got it wrong. So I think the question also is, how do you manage to remain viable and sustainable, yet remain true to the journalistic principles and ethical principles?
Right, back live with you tonight here on In Focus, and a conversation continues with our guest tonight. Prof, you see what happens in the digital age. I just gave you a whole new name. Tomorrow you will be called Professor William Wasserman. I mean, why not? Professor Wasserman, as well as William Bird, still with us here tonight. I wanted to talk about this phenomenon, and William Bird has touched on it already. The phenomenon where we have now all voices really being equal and having equal access to the public discourse via technology, and technology being able to enable that. How that has impacted on, the credibility of the news that we report, and not necessarily reflecting outwards now, reflecting on us ourselves as the media and what we have been putting out there. Prof?
Well, I would certainly firstly question the question of all voices being equal and having equal access. I think there are still vast disparities in terms of access to data, for instance, access to mobile platforms, social media, and so on. But I think, as you point out, I think the landscape has changed radically. The digital disruption has made a huge brought about huge changes in journalism. I think the challenge here, as you point out, is how to discern between media that can be trusted, that are authoritative voices, and those that are less trusted. And I think here again, it's so important for established news organizations to be above board and to not make those mistakes, not peddle disinformation, be accurate, be independent, and increasingly, I think, as audiences try to navigate this new world where there are so many voices, there's such a diversity of information coming at them, that they know who to trust, and that trust is not disappointed.
Yeah, certainly, William. Others have been saying traditional media is acting a little bit precious, wanting to protect their privilege of being the gatekeepers of news and entertainment. It's no longer that way now. We have everybody has a voice, and opinions are no longer formulated the traditional way. Is that a good thing?
Well, it's a good thing to be questioning former established media and the narratives that they put out, because there are sometimes problematic narratives that come out of established and traditional media. I think the key difference, though, is that an entity like Newzroom Afrika subscribes to the BCCSA, so that's the Broadcast Complaints Commission of South Africa. there's particular license conditions. It means that if you don't subscribe and adhere to practicing good quality journalism, and part of that means that you have to check things, you have to verify things before you run them on air. There are real consequences to that. In the most dire instance, you can be fined and you can be taken off air. ICASA can withdraw you, or MultiChoice can withdraw their license, their agreement with you. So you can actually be taken off air. So there are very real consequences. There's also a level of accountability. Now, any person or journalist or media house that subscribes to those kinds of values, be they the BCCSA or the Press Council's Code, those kinds of things are entities that allow the public to say, if they do something wrong, which, media get things wrong, there's something that can be done about it, there's a level of accountability, and that's part of democratic process. And that's fundamentally different to someone who starts something, they claim to be news, for example, or putting out accurate information, and they just put out complete nonsense. There's no accountability for it. There's no means of which you can test them or verify those things. And so what this has done, this shift to digital, is that it has opened up a number of new and exciting and different voices and possibilities. But at the same time, it's also introduced and put people who just put out nonsense, put them on an equivalent footing if they've got a reasonable following. And that's a real problem, because the one says we're accountable, we're adhering to these and these standards and ethics, and the other one says I'll just put out nonsense, whatever's there. And it is important for the public to be able to know which of the sources is doing what and who they should trust, so that they can and should be able to find news and information that speaks to them in their area, in their language, to their interests, to their specific interests. For example, if it's business, if it's cultural practice, whatever that may be, you should be able to find that kind of thing. So there's, it's a double-edged sword, the shift to digital. It's certainly opened up huge potential, but at the same time, we're seeing that it also offers, unprecedented threats to media freedom.
Yeah. Prof, in terms of the training, traditional methods of training journalists, has the digital age impacted that, and you find yourself having to come up with relevant ways of training, certainly to close the gap so that journalists know how to behave, especially in the digital age, in terms of their sourcing practices and how coverage is done?
Certainly. I think, the one aspect of digital is that, there's a lot of new bells and whistles. And I think those things are important to master. And I think it's important for journalists entering the job market, for instance, to be able to work across different platforms, utilize different technologies, etc. But I think a huge caveat there, and I think William has touched on this, is the aspect of remaining true to the fundamental values of journalism. And so some of these values are ethical values that have to do with, independence, accuracy, truth, all of these things that we've already mentioned. Another aspect, I think, is that digital is also seductive in the sense that it can create lazy journalists. It's much easier now to source information aggregated from the web, copy and paste, tweets, and put it in a news story and say there's a report. And I think the danger of sort of cell phone and desktop journalism is something that we also have to guard against. Again, we coming from this deliberations today where we spoke about community media, the importance of being embedded in communities and the importance of actually going out and speaking to real people and observing what's going on around you. I mean, that is a really fundamental value in journalism that we should guard against the loss of, So I think, as William mentioned, it's a double-edged sword, and there are lots of new wonderful opportunities. And when we train journalists, we certainly want to make sure that they are mastering those. At the same time, we also want to make sure that they understand their context, that they understand the democratic context, for instance, that they know what their role is in society and how to engage with people, power relations between journalists and communities. All these things are really as important, if not maybe more important, than learning to master a new tool or app.
Yeah. What was the conversation, particularly today, as you're putting it, as you were focusing on community journalism in particular? Is journalism still viewed by communities as a service that is being provided to society?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the South African media landscape is that we have this three-tiered system, right? We have a public broadcast, the community broadcast, public media, community media, and commercial media. And I think, community media often are not seen as sort of maybe the glamorous sort of big resources, big stories. Yet they do really important work and in communities, and we wanted to shine the light on them. Often these community organizations struggle to remain viable, but yet they are providing a vital service in communities that communities cannot get elsewhere sometimes. It's media that's provided in their own language, stories about what happens in their own backyards, their own municipalities, for instance. And so we wanted to ask questions around what is press freedom, investigative journalism, fact-checking. How do these things play out in those community organizations where sometimes the stakes are very high, and the questions that they grapple with are sometimes very different from the sort of things that big newsrooms deal with.
Yeah. William Bird, we're heading to 2024 with a real chance maybe of even seeing coalition governments at provincial, others are saying even at national level, which certainly, I mean, if what we are seeing at local community level is anything to go by, it's going to be a chaotic space. What are the real threats that we need to look out for, or new threats, especially when it comes to reporting?
So I think one of less a threat, but more one of the greatest challenges that our media are going to face in 2024 is that this is the first time we're going to have independent candidates. So you're going to have something like several hundred political parties, and you're going to have independent candidates. And broadcasters particularly are going to be faced with how on earth do you give equitable coverage to these things. And what we've seen historically is that media, instead of saying, we're going to adopt this particular process and approach for how we cover them, what is going to constitute an election story, what we've seen is that whichever political party can drum up the most ridiculous or outrageous thing or steer the news agenda in their direction, they tend to get a lot of news coverage. So I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be about how do we realize equitable coverage in the lead up to 2024 and ensure that actually news organizations adopt a particular process for saying what's going to constitute an election story. It can't just be, a political party going into a community and shaking hands and kissing babies. That's not news. It's just electioneering. It's critical, as Prof said right at the start of the interview, that they actually go and ask and explain, what the policy issues are and what on earth is actually going on. Let's ask difficult questions. I think in terms of one of the biggest challenges and threats, obviously, is going to be, because the elections are so contested, is going to definitely be around making sure that the elections take place in a safe and secure environment, that we don't have threats of violence. I think the increase in online harms, the very real threat of mis and disinformation, potentially incitement leading to violence in the run-up to these elections is going to be key.
I appreciate you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming on tonight. That's Professor Herman Wasserman from the Stellenbosch University and William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa.